Today's guest is Wendy Ryan, who is based in Silicon Valley in the USA. Wendy is the founder of a consulting organization, Cadabra, which is quite a fascinating organization doing amazing work in the leadership space and change management space with organizations around the globe. We focus a lot on the book that Wendy has written, Learn, Lead, Lift. Who it's for is aimed at leaders, but it's leaders who are leading teams, but also leaders who are individual contributors and by taking a leadership role within the organization. And that comes at every stage within an organization. Really, really good conversation to actually dig into, the leadership challenges that Wendy sees facing, understanding what mindful leadership is all about, and she really has a very good definition of what that is, and how you turn up as a leader and impact the people that you need to impact. But we also talk about the challenges of leader in this kind of very changing and volatile world, and also the whole issue around how we can potentially grow diversity at senior leadership levels in organizations worldwide, and also really what does it take to be a great leader. So I really encourage you to listen to Wendy. She's an expert in her field and she's a great communicator, and I'd also highly recommend her book. It's a really, really good read and a really good how-to book to read, so I really would highly recommend that. We'd love you to really give us a review for the podcast, because the more reviews we get, the more people we can reach. And that at the end of the day is the objective. But in the meantime, sit back and listen to the very, very interesting Wendy Ryan. Wendy, thank you so much indeed for joining us today. It's a real pleasure to have you all the way from Silicon Valley.
It's such a pleasure to be with you, John. Thank you.
I'm looking forward to this. Maybe just before we get into, because I want to talk about the book that you published recently and the work that you do, but maybe before we get into that, you might just give kind of a brief background on your own history and something about you and how you've got to where you are right now.
Sure. Well, I have the good fortune to be living and working out of Silicon Valley, California, which really has been fruitful for me as far as just the wealth of ideas and innovation that we're so known for here. However, I've also lived a number of other places. I've lived outside of the US as well. So I think one thing that really shows up in my work with others, and certainly shows up in the book, is a pretty broad perspective around people, around backgrounds, around why we do the things we do, and how can we help each other do things better.
Okay, so the organization that you're heading up, Cadabra, maybe just explain a little bit what that does.
Yeah, so our purpose is really to help people lead better. And so whether that is something that people come to us, they find out about us as an individual, or we are introduced to them through their organization, everything we do is aligned around helping leadership flourish. And I think that certainly involves at times helping a team flourish. Sometimes that extends to even more broadly to change or to culture. But I think at the end of the day, and I wonder how this resonates with you, John, in the work you do, but it really depends a lot on each of us as individuals, whether we identify as leaders or not, to recognize how we're showing up and what can we do differently.
Well, no, I agree with you. I always think that the old saying is that if the change starts with me, if I want something to be different, I've got to be different, and it's just understanding what way I need to be different in order to affect the change. So I agree with you. The other kind of part of your world that, if I understand correctly, is that you've been an angel investor, and primarily in kind of BIPOC and LGBTQ women-led businesses. Just wondering why those particular segments, or am I right in what I'm saying?
Yes, definitely. So I wish, in my ultimate fantasy, I wish I had hundreds of billions of dollars to invest, because there are far more wonderful, innovative ideas and people with enormous talent out there than I think we even realize yet.
Mm.
And I certainly see a lot of them, and it's always hard to recognize that I only have the capacity to invest in so many. But one of the things that I uh, like to do is say I look at constraints, like how big is the size of one's wallet as an investor, and how do we make friends with that? And so for me, recognizing that I have a limited amount that I can invest in that asset class, I've really chosen to take the path of where can I have the greatest impact? Where can I do the most good for the biggest number of people the fastest? And if you look at all of the data, as well as all of the anecdotal evidence that we have, it's really, really clear that there is a huge gap in terms of the level of investment that gets directed to white, hetero, cisgendered men, and this is worldwide, compared to people who have other identities. And that's a problem because we're not necessarily funding and supporting the ideas that are most likely to have the biggest impact. So there are lots of reasons for that gap, but I've just chosen personally to say that I want to do something about that with the capacity that I have.
I think it's great. I think it was great what you're doing, because I think that if you look at future business, if you look at the demographics and everything, that the way that's changing over the next number of years, if we don't have greater diversity in our major organizations and also in our privately owned organizations, we're really going to be, we're not going to be in good shape. And
Yes.
I still think that I still hope that because of various events that happened in the public domain, that diversity got a lot of publicity, and rightly so. I hope that translates into real change, and I really do. I mean, I say that carefully because I hope that it isn't one of these things that just disappears off the agenda, from being a hot topic to being, oh well, that was last year. Because I think that if we look at large corporate America, it's still a boys' club,
Indeed.
and that needs to change. And it's still a white boys' club, right?
Yes.
And that needs to change. And I think that, so that's why I'm very impressed with the fact that you're doing that work, because it matters. What we all do matters, and even if it's just only one brick in the wall, it makes a difference. And I think it's important to remember that. Can I switch to your book, Learn, Lead, and Lift? And just, who did you write that book for, and why did you write it?
I wrote the book for people who wanted to get better at leadership, whether they were an experienced CEO who said, "Oh, I'm getting some feedback that's giving me some clues that maybe there are some things I need to do differently." I also wrote it for the 21-year-old person who maybe they just graduated university or they have been on some other path and they're trying to find their way. And also for people that are just managing other people for the first time. So really, I would say anyone who's sort of in that inflection point in their journey in life and career where they recognize that, wow, there's some things that if I knew more about this, it would be helpful to me. If I
Yeah.
showed up differently, I could be more effective. So I think for the people that have a certain openness and readiness to how can I do this a bit differently?
Mm.
That's really who the book is for.
And I think it's really important that in this time, in leadership has always been important, and will continue to be. But I think that if you look particularly in larger organizations where they're becoming more matrix, they're becoming flatter. It's managing a team of people is not an option that's open to everybody, right? Nor should it be. But it's not going to be. That is not going to be there. That opportunity is not going to be there as much as it was in the past. But I think that people can be leaders as an individual contributor, and understanding how they really demonstrate those leadership skills as an independent, as an individual contributor. I think that's really important. You talk about being a mindful leader. And I'm very conscious that, there's an awful lot of talk about mindfulness and meditation, all of that, some of which is great, some of which is rubbish. But I mean, I would be a fan, and I certainly would be an advocate of mindfulness. But I'm just curious, when you talk about mindful leader, what do you mean by that?
I think that's a great question. And what I mean by that is certainly tied to self-awareness. So as a leader, it's important that we recognize that however we got into that role, because some people raise their hand for leadership and other people don't. They kind of end up there by default. And so however you got there, I think a key thing is this recognition that you have disproportionate impact on people around you. That's just part of the construct of leadership. So being self-aware to say, hey, I realize that what I do, how I think, what I know, how I show up to others is actually going to have a bigger ripple effect than just me and my little piece of the world. So having that mentality leads us to get more clear about, ooh, I need to pay attention to who am I being as a leader and why am I doing this? So to me, it's much deeper than a mindfulness practice, although mindfulness is a tool to help us be more mindful as leaders.
It's also about emotional intelligence, isn't it?
For sure.
Because of understanding, how my behavior impacts others. Because I often think it's interesting, in organizations we talk about values, right? And we can spend,
I hope so.
Yeah, exactly. And we can spend a lot of time actually kind of crafting them. And then, years ago, they'd be put up in the reception area of an office and kind of, oh, there's the values, but actually nobody could remember them, right? But where people get disenchanted is the disconnect between what we say are our values and how we behave.
For sure. And I think one of the best sort of indicators of that, or tests around that, is what are the stories that we're telling? So as leaders, what do we talk about and what do we reinforce through our stories? So helping people to see values in action, not just through our behavior, but in what we choose to talk about, is a very powerful way to make sure values are really operationalized in the organization. So you're so right, John, when you say, the values that are etched into the glass panel of a reception area or on a plaque somewhere in every conference room are really meaningless if people, A, don't see their leaders modeling that very consistently, and two, we're not telling stories that reinforce what those look like in action.
I always think that the really good challenge, and it's not my question, I wish I'd crafted it, but it isn't. But the really good challenge to make to ourselves as leaders is to ask ourselves the question, what is it about me that makes me worth following?
Yes. So I always encourage people who are starting the journey of becoming a better leader, and or are at some point reflecting at some point in that journey, going back and grounding, as Simon Sinek does, into your why. So why am I a leader? Why do I want to do this? Again, regardless of how I got there, I'm here now. So what's the why? And then who am I being? Not just what am I doing, but who am I being? It has to be embodied in everything we do. It has to be something that we're living into. We're not just giving lip service to.
Just when you're talking there, now it just occurred to me that, when you look at the workforce in the marketplace at this moment in time, it's probably the first time, I'd imagine, where there is multi-generations, in the workforce simultaneously. And it's a big challenge for leaders in managing in that multi-generational environment, isn't it? What issues does that bring up in your experience for leaders?
I think, a lot has been written and talked about with that, and I'm glad that on the one hand, there is interest both in terms of academia and among practitioners in what does this multi-generational workforce mean, and how do we think about this as in terms of leadership and management. I think what to me is so important about that is a couple of things. One, just recognizing that because there is this really wide spectrum of ages and of not just age, but many, uh, the generations, the baby boomer generation, as we call it in the US, demographically does not share the same makeup as Generation Z, for example, who
Absolutely.
are the folks that are entering the workforce now. So it's not just a question of how are we separated in terms of time and history. We are Generation Z, for example, far less white, far less likely to be affiliated with particular religion, far more likely to know someone who identifies as gender nonconforming or
Mm,
non-binary. In fact, upwards of 30% of people in Generation Z know someone personally or are themselves gender nonconforming. Baby boomer generation didn't even hear about that concept. I'm Gen X, and growing up, I mean, there was no concept in at
no,
least in the public discourse about gender potentially not being a binary construct. So I think we have to recognize, first of all, that the differences are not just age-based and experience-based. There's a huge shift in some of the mindsets and how
absolutely.
we understand the world is very
Mm.
different.
Mm. I think it is. I mean, I think that if you look at the world that we live in, this kind of the VUCA world of volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. I mean, when you look at the research that you did for the book and the experience that you have, what what does that mean for leaders living and leading in that world, in the VUCA world?
Well, VUCA has always been with us. So even though the term didn't get coined until the early 90s, and it was actually coined by the US military, and it was an attempt to describe what was different about trying to lead in a battlefield context on the
Mm,
ground versus at HQ where people are planning, with their big wall map and their little pieces moving around a table. I think we get this visual from the movies, and I don't know how accurate that is, but that's sort of what comes to mind for me. But it's like, what happens when you're actually in the field? And I think it's always been with us, but what has changed is that the pace of that, or the volume around VUCA, has been turned up. So whereas maybe the level of VUCA in the world where we had to operate was, say, at a level 2, it's now been turned up to a level 6 or 7.
yeah,
So the intensity of that is much bigger, and that really calls us to lead differently. I think that a lot of the things that assumptions we grew up with as leaders that came out of the 20th century, that came out of a, a different way of thinking about leadership in the Industrial Revolution, we're still playing catch up now and saying, what do we need to do differently? And it really starts with how are we thinking? What are the mindsets that we're holding on to, and how are they
yeah,
serving us?
yeah. Challenging, you know.
It's very challenging.
Can I go back to something that I just want to just talk a little bit about, because it's something that's very close to my own heart, and I mentioned it earlier on, and you spoke about it as well. Is how do we go about getting greater diversity in the leadership positions?
That's $1 million question.
It is, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, it
and
is.
you've and you've 1 minute to answer it. So,
Oh yes, I'll try to be concise. It is. I would say, first of all, diversity in and of itself cannot be the goal. The goal has to be equity and inclusion, meaning that
Mm.
we actually recognize that identity matters instead of pretending that it doesn't matter. We actually make peace with the fact that we're not really operating in a meritocracy. As much as we might wish we were, we don't all start from the same place in life. Um, and the impact of that is cumulative over our lifespan. So if we are wanting to have the benefit of diversity, we must have a strong focus and we must have action around increasing equity and inclusion. Equity is everybody gets what they need to be able to leverage the same amount of opportunity. Inclusion is everybody feels they belong, regardless of how they identify, regardless of what they started with in life. And those are huge, huge goals. We know, again, from the data and from both anecdotal and otherwise, that when we are successful in creating greater equity and inclusion, there is a net economic and social benefit that helps all of us. So developing the mindset that there is an infinite pie and that by creating more for others, we simply have more is going to be essential for that change to happen. We have to get away from this scarcity mentality that we've had for so long, that if we share power, if we try to increase equity for someone else, then that means there's less for me.
I heard somebody describing what the difference between equity and inclusion was, that equity is being invited to the dance and inclusion is being asked to dance.
That's a
Um,
great analogy. Yeah.
isn't it? I always think it was a great line. One of the things that always fascinates me is that when we talk about, what separates a great leader from an average one, and I'm just really curious as what your answer is to that question.
I love that question. To me, a great leader is someone who ultimately is aware that their leadership has to be directed toward something other than their own self-interest. If I'm leading people and I am doing that in service of a stated objective, it's okay if that's also benefiting me in the end, but when it's purely about our own self-interest, that is not great leadership. That is something else. I don't know what that is, but people know it when they see it.
I think it's true. And I think that, I mean, if we look around the world, I mean, the world is crying out for leaders. Business is also crying out for leaders, but I think it's what you're talking about there, and what you talk about in the book, learn, lead, and lift is super stuff. I think it's something that everybody at every level in an organization should get and read. Before we wrap up, and you can tell us, Wendy, how people can get in touch with you and buy your book. Two questions I ask everybody. One is a book other than your own, that you have read that's had an impact upon you.
I read a lot all the time, and
I
I'm
can imagine.
constantly blown away by the quality of thinking in the books that are coming out, especially in the last couple of years. When I think about this question and what really started the snowball effect for me of how I think about coaching and I think about leadership development, I always go back to Marshall Goldsmith's "What got you here will not
Oh,
get you
yeah,
there,
yeah,
won't
yeah,
get you
yeah.
there." It's such a accessible and yet profoundly true um, look at what it means to, I think, be a leader and the impact that you have and how to actually go about shifting what you do. So that is absolutely a cornerstone for me.
Yeah, I have great respect for Marshall Goldsmith, and I've done some work around the stakeholder-centered coaching,
Yes,
and I really I've great admirer of his work. Daily
likewise.
rituals, do you have them? What do they do for you? And are you happy to share them?
I do. And I hate to sound, cliche, and I think sometimes people roll their eyes when we talk about a gratitude practice, but I think that's the
No.
best way I can describe it. I am very intentional when I wake up in the morning about finding one or two things that I am thankful for, I'm grateful for, and I also think very intentionally about how can I cultivate joy today. And I think I developed that practice because I went through a lot of heavy, hard stuff. And to me, it has been a really effective way of balancing some of that heaviness and saying, it's equally important that we look for ways to cultivate joy and that we start with that. That has been really powerful and transformative for me personally.
I would be a great believer in gratitude. I write it every morning, and so I would concur with you. I think it's really powerful because even in the most challenging of times that we all have, from time to time, there's always something to. I mean, that you can find something that you're grateful for,
Yes.
and I think that is quite kind of a huge impact on how you face the day. So I'd absolutely agree with you. I love that. Thank you very much for sharing that with us. So Wendy, where can people get in touch with you, and where can they buy the book? Well, I know they can buy it on Amazon.
Yes, you can certainly buy it anywhere that books are sold. The website that is dedicated to the book is learnleadlift.com. Learn Lead Lift is all one word. And there you can find links to order the book, and also you can click on a button that will take you to free resources. So we have a lot of downloads available on the Cadabra website, which is our company website, that take some of the models and tools that are in the book and make it accessible for you to start using and applying right away. So highly recommend checking those out, and also picking up the book. It makes a great gift for someone in your life who would appreciate some
Absolutely.
guidance and some new ideas about leadership.
Absolutely. Wendy, thank you so much. We'll put all of that in the show notes. So it'll be all there, but people listening at least can go now as they're listening to you. Wendy, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a real honor and a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you, John. Likewise.